And so I bet him that he couldn't keep cycling until next Thursday. So I think right now he's somewhere in Switzerland or like trying to cycle through the channel. I think I'm not sure, but he'll be back soon.
Yeah,
So in the meantime, I'll sign all of our paychecks.
sounds good, Mick. Yeah, Ryan is notably absent from today's show, but that is because he is on the other side of the world. Even though that doesn't really affect your ability to log in for a stream, he is taking some well-deserved time off. So we'll have Ryan back
Welcome to Coffee Talk.
next
I'm Mick.
show.
With me is Audra Streetman, and we are co-varless today, but I'm
Yes.
sure he'll find a way to take credit for this episode. So thanks for tuning in. Got some folks pouring into the chat. Hello, everyone that's coming in. Welcome to Coffee Talk with Audra and Mick. That's right. So Audra, let's do some news. You want to do some news first?
Yeah, let's roll the clip. All right, so first story for today is actually a new Telegram vulnerability that was publicly disclosed this week. I think it was last night that this blog may have come out. It's a blog post by the software engineer Dan Riva. He said he found the vulnerability in February, alerted Telegram about it, but so far he says it's gone unaddressed. So that's why it's now a public disclosure. Worth pointing out, though, that this is a local privilege escalation vulnerability. So this means that the attacker would have to gain initial access first to a device in order to access the user's mic or camera, which is what this would achieve. So basically, the one thing that I did not know that I learned from this blog is that macOS does not require uploaded apps to be signed with a hardened runtime entitlement, which is essentially added security rules to protect against certain types of attacks like code injection or DLL hijacking. But it's
And this
interesting
is
because
versus
I
iOS, which
right,
has those,
iOS,
right?
yeah, iOS requires it. macOS does not default require it. However, Drew, our producer, pointed out that you can enable it with macOS. But the point is for this vulnerability, apps versus desktop makes a difference, right, in the feasibility of the attack. So without the hardened runtime, like with Mac OS, an attacker would be able to use like a particular environment variable to inject a dynamic library, which would then capture video from the camera and then save the recording to disk. So when researchers actually tried to do this and inject the dylib or the dynamic library, they found that Mac OS was trying to run the application through the terminal, which then inherited the terminal sandbox. So they had to bypass that to get to get through. They used the launch agent directory, which then allowed them to run processes in the background, schedule the execution, and then they were actually able to record, I think it was like 3 seconds of video, and then save that to disk.
Hmm.
So I mean, the takeaway is that you could exploit a vulnerability in a third-party application, which would then grant you additional permissions, which is even more than what would be available to you with root access to that device. And then you could in turn bypass Apple's privacy settings for that particular app, or just for your camera or your mic or anything that's privacy enabled.
I get my big takeaways from this, and first was the part, mobile. If you're a mobile user of Telegram, you're fine for the most part, and aside from the other security risks involved in using Telegram on mobile, make sure it's updated. The other takeaway is this is specific to Telegram on macOS desktop, which is very specific in itself. It's a pretty novel execution the way it works, but if I have access that's required already, there are
Right,
much worse things I can do on the
right.
operating system
And that's
than
why this
that are
isn't
not
critical.
unique or
Yeah,
specific to Telegram, right? If I
right.
have access to the host, then in addition to messing with Telegram, I can do all these other cool things. So, take that with a grain of salt, and remember that, mobile development and desktop development are completely different beasts. And yeah, make sure you have hardened runtime enabled on your desktop.
Yeah, and I am curious because this was reported to Telegram, but I wonder if it's Apple that really needs to make the change in terms of making, hardened runtime the default for Mac OS.
So that was my second takeaway was this was February, it's May. The timeline and we chatted a bit about this because it's not my wheelhouse at all. We should talk to folks like Casey, the gang over at Bug Crowd. But that coordinated disclosure, that Vince process, we talked about a little bit. It's really unique to this. And if I let you know about a vulnerability and nothing happened, I'm not really sure who the onus is on. Obviously it starts with the vendor and their application, but
Mhm.
I'm not sure, what's on Dan, what he could have done in addition to, kind of contacting them and waiting.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's interesting to see kind of where that falls in terms of how it would be fixed going forward. But we have a lot of news to talk about, so let's go on to our next story. We have some ransomware stories that we want to get to. The first is the city of Dallas is still recovering from a ransomware attack. This was 2 weeks ago that this happened, and it caused significant damage to systems used by first responders and also the court system. So the record is reporting that police had to actually take notes by hand, kind of like they went back 3 decades. Court hearings and trials were also impacted, and officials say it's going to take several more weeks until everything returns back to normal. So just going to show another example of, a large city having pretty severe impacts from a ransomware attack.
I thought this was really, really, well, not unique or new or anything else. I thought it was, wow, it's Dallas. Dallas is a big city, right? Like there's a lot
Yeah.
of people, 1.3 million, I think, live in that metro area. So just the ripple effects of one, those services not working, but the people affected by those services not working, and so on and so on. I think that's incredible, and it also speaks to the normalization isn't the right word, but it's the word I keep coming back to. There are a lot of big cities getting hit by ransomware, right? Oakland,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Minneapolis had a thing. Even small cities. You mentioned where in
Wheat Ridge.
Colorado?
Yeah, Wheat Ridge, Colorado had a ransomware attack. I don't know the impact with that one, but there's a lot of smaller, suburban areas that are also dealing with their own uh, incidents. But it's interesting. Oakland actually declared a local state of emergency in response to that ransomware
They
attack, so
kind
that
of
they could
have to, right?
yeah, so they could expedite resources and try to keep things up and running because, when your police department is functioning like it's, the 60s, right? In terms of like taking notes instead of having, like
I
accurate
mean, it's
access.
Dallas, so it's probably
Yeah.
been operating like 1860s. Hey, but
Oh gosh.
it's it's an incredible thing. I know the city of Dallas is coordinating with a couple firms that are on retainer, as well as the FBI involved. My bigger concern here is that ransomware is becoming normalized in large scales against cities. You can only declare so many states of emergency before your resources get drained nationally. So what do you do? Today, Dallas, if there is a Washington, D.C., if there is a New York or something like,
Mhm.
LA, a large scale city,
Yeah.
that's going to be a big problem.
And it's interesting too with the ransom demands, right? Like you think if it's local government, then it's not as well resourced for a ransom demand from like an adversary point of view, right? In terms of compared to like a big corporation, right? In terms of who's going to pay the most. But the Wheat Ridge example, that was a $5 million ransom demand for Wheat Ridge,
Right.
Colorado. I don't believe Wheat Ridge paid that as far as I know, but there was also one, I think it was a municipality in maybe Illinois or one of the states that starts with an I, and they paid, I think, $400,000 is what I remember MCSoft, a cybersecurity firm in New Zealand, reported in their state of ransomware report, was that there was a smaller local government in one of the US states that did pay that amount. It was the one that they actually could find that had actually paid the ransom. So anyway,
Almost
it's an
like
interesting.
ransomware isn't the point.
Yeah. So
Anyway, we'll talk about this for the whole show because ransomware is awesome, always will be. Uh, Speaking of ransomware, what happened to
yes.
Dragos?
Yeah, so Dragos is actually getting a lot of praise right now from the cybersecurity community after their transparency following an incident where Dragos said a hacking group logged into a new hire's email account. They accessed limited data, but it did include some customer information, like an IP of a customer. So when Dragos did not respond to the extortion demands from that group, the cyber criminals started reaching out to like contacts of Dragos and customers and other employees to try to elicit a response from them, which did not work. But I think the biggest takeaway is that Dragos got in front of it, right? They released this blog being as transparent as they could be before anyone else reported on it, which I think is something that other companies' PR teams should pay attention to, because people notice when companies try to bury incidents under the rug or they're intentionally murky about what's happening. I think being transparent is actually a good thing in terms of how your company is perceived.
Oh, 100%. And kudos to Rob, not just for the beard, but just for the way the company responded. I think, we keep saying everyone's going to get breached. It's just a matter of when, and hopefully it's never you. But I think they were very open in the manner in which the attack vector was initial, the way it kind of transpired in the attack chain itself, and the series of events and how they responded. I think it's a great example of being, very forthright and also having a great knowing Rob and the gang at Dragos. They've tabletopped this more than one time, right? Like this scenario is exactly the things that we talk about. If an incident like this happens at your company, what would you do? And the way they responded is kind of textbook. It's very open, very transparent, and the steps they took to cut access and to find out what was accessed. With great example for everyone out there.
Yeah, definitely. So those were our two ransomware stories. There were plenty more, but we have a timeline that we're trying to stick to. So our next news story, this is a CISA advisory with a number of other agencies, a joint advisory that they released recently about snake malware. It's used by a group called Turla. It's an espionage group that's believed to be part of Russia's FSB. And this comes after the FBI actually targeted this particular malware in an operation that they called Medusa, and they were able to actually gain physical access to computers that were compromised with the snake malware, and they were able to study it and create a tool called Perseus, which they then used to decrypt and decode some of the snake communications. They actually had Perseus issue commands to Snake on May 8th, which caused it to overwrite its own components without actually affecting the host machine. And so the DOJ said that this was able to dismantle a global network of malware infected computers. And Mick, I know you've obviously been doing this for a long time, and Snake has also been used for a long time, like almost 2 decades, right? I mean, this is kind of a long-term process from this group.
Yes, I am that old. Thank you for that reminder. I appreciate that. That's
Your
great.
experience, you have a lot of experience
Mm,
with this, right?
vintage, vintage. To your point, right?
Vintage.
FSB Center 16 has been around forever and ever, and honestly, they'll still be around. This was a huge operation, and Drew flashed the graphic up, and you can see, the fivest of eyes. All the logos, all of the countries kind of got together on this one. It's a great effort, and there's a lot of people involved that their names aren't on there and helped out a lot. So kudos to them as well. I think when you look at the technical details of what was involved in the Snake malware and the Snake network, it is a really, you can see why it was the cornerstone, the keystone rather of the FSB collection, the opportunities. It was such a great feat. Pretty much they built a Tor network, right?
Yeah.
And did all their things on a Tor network, which is crazy. But at the same time, they did kind of sloppy things where, the for all you crypto nerds out there, like the Diffie-Hellman key, I think was 128 bits, which is really weird. Um, but then other novel crypto things where it was 62-bit or base 62. And that was just one of the one-off things that was kind of contributed to longevity of this. So I think it's amazing that when you think back about how many of us graybeards got started using, researching Turla and Dukes and everything that came after that, or even on the Chinese side, when you go back to Sunshop, that it's been around for so long and it was in use and so effective that the dismantling of it really is a setback to operations. And I think that's the goal, is to disrupt the technical capabilities. There's a guy you may have heard of. All he says is impose cost. And I think that this joint operation surely did that. And I think that Russian intelligence will rebuild. They do have other capabilities, but this is going to be a huge dent. This is basically shutting one eye.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's similar to what we're seeing with the FBI with ransomware groups, right? Where they're able to infiltrate their infrastructure and then take it down, but also, gain intelligence about how these groups work. They're able to create decryption keys. They're able to help victims and then also get insight onto how many victims are reporting ransomware attacks. That was another report in the record today with the Hive takedown. So, it's just interesting to see that even though they'll probably rebuild and start up new operations, it still hurts to have that taken down. It's still a disruption. So, and Turla is a pretty advanced group. I mean, they're the ones that
Yes,
use
this is the big kids
satellites.
table, a hundred
Yeah,
percent, right.
yeah.
Turla is
Um,
100%. This is the adults table, and
mhm.
really just knocking that down a peg, I think is really, really incredible.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm interested to see. I haven't read through the full advisory. I just linked to it in the chat. It's very long. There's a lot of information about, IOCs and how it's developed and the history of it. So, highly recommend people take a look if they have time. But now let's go ahead and transition to our upcoming events because we have a couple to bring up. And Mick, you and Ryan are going to have a state of security webinar later this month. And that is the state of security report that just came out, right? That you'll be talking about and some of the takeaways from that.
100%. Ryan and I are going to sit down. It's our annual get together where we go through the state of security. We will talk about what we got horribly wrong or horribly right last year and what to expect for the rest of 2023 as we're looking at the data and what we've seen. And
Yeah,
then don't forget about July. Comp is
yeah,
coming up.
yes, conf. I can't believe. I mean, July. That seems so far away, but it's not really that far away. So
Time has no meaning.
it's
It'll
a
be like
yeah.
just like that. It'll,
I
yeah.
know. Yeah, and then it's summertime. Is it summer already? I don't even know. I think that's in June. But anyway,
When does summer starts? No, I think it's
is it
like,
June
is
10th
that,
or
is that
something? Or am I wrong?
June?
Now I gotta
No,
Google it.
summer starts in May. No, I'm gonna get beat up by someone who knows how the sun works.
I think it's in June. I think it's mid-June sometime, like around June 20th or something like that. So anyway, tangent. Um, so those are our upcoming events, and I know we'll have more on Bluenomicon at Conf, the book that you just created, Mick, with a bunch of really cool authors. So we'll have more on that at Conf for anyone who's attending. Um, but for now, let's go ahead and move on now to our 60-second charity challenge.
And now, Splunk's Cybersecurity 60-Second Charity Challenge. Remember the rules. You've got to get through an entire subject in 60 seconds, or you donate to today's charity of choice. Good luck!
Okay, I'm excited for this one because it gets me fired up. I don't know if it gets you fired up, Mick, but we're talking
No,
about
I hear
AI
you're pretty fired up about it.
AI regulation, right? I mean, it's an ongoing debate. It's very relevant right now with ChatGPT and all the large language models, neural networks, all the new emerging technology with AI, a lot of uncertainty about what this means and how it's going to evolve. And then also, how should it be regulated or should it be regulated? And so there was an interview on Meet the Press recently with the former Google CEO, Eric Schmidt, who, when asked about emerging AI technologies, said that there is, quote, no way a non-industry person can understand what's possible. And so his argument is that it should be up to the companies that create and release this technology to set the guardrails, and then policymakers can build upon that. But let the experts make the decisions, right? That's kind of his stance on this, which got me a little bit. We'll share our responses to that. That's the challenge for this week, Mick. Is what do you think about that? Should it be regulated? If so, how and by who? So do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
Well, what's our charity?
Oh, right, the charity. The whole reason why we're doing this is the Save Elephant Foundation. It's a Thai nonprofit dedicated to providing care and assistance to Thailand and the Asian elephant population and other animals in need. And Mick, you picked that one for today. So,
I did.
yeah, so that's the charity. Do you want to go first? Since
You know what? We're doing something. It's just you and I today, so sure, I'll go first.
okay.
All right, the question is, should AI be regulated? Absolutely, because let's face it, I don't want Roombas secretly forming an army and plotting to overthrow us while I'm binge watching Going for the Gold on Disney. So, if you ever read 1984, you know that's a bit of a downer. It's a haunting picture of a totalitarian regime controlled by every aspect of citizens' lives. The rapid advancement of AI raises these same concerns. privacy, dystopian surveillance. The other example is Terminator 2. Don't forget that. Arnold Schwarzenegger trying to protect humanity from self-aware machines hell bent on wiping us out. So there could be a robot uprising, could be override surveillance. So who should regulate this? It should not be just the experts. So a world full of politicians, no. A world full of Erics, no. It shouldn't just be a few powerful entities. It demands a collaborative effort from policymakers, experts, scientists, representatives from various sectors. So that multi-stakeholder approach is what's going to govern AI and make it live up to its full potential.
All right. Lesson learned. If I'm going to compete against you, Mick, I got to put in some pop culture references because it's just each time.
I don't know if 1984 is a pop culture reference.
Well, Terminator 2, I think last time, what was it last time? I don't remember.
The Wu-Tang Clan.
Oh yeah, the Wu-Tang Clan. That was what it was. And someone said I hated the Wu-Tang Clan, which is not.
I don't understand why you do, Audra. The musical genius.
Complete lie. It's just. Anyway, okay. I'm ready whenever you are, Drew. All right, so I was a bit irked by Eric Schmidt's stance on AI regulation. It's this kind of hubris that is unfortunately common in the tech industry, and it's misinformed. So emerging AI technologies are not too advanced for the public to understand. It's dangerous to assume that people who use technology are not capable of providing input about that technology with regard to their privacy and concerns about bias. It's also important to consider who has a financial interest in controlling AI regulation. It's the tech companies, of course, which may be the least willing to consider negative societal impacts. When you see these decisions, when you leave it to just tech experts alone, you end up with groupthink. And people of similar backgrounds, that's when they arrive at the same conclusion without consideration of how their decisions could impact minority or marginalized groups. It's the reason why Amazon had to scrap its hiring algorithm, because the data set was from the previous 10 years, which was male-dominated and ended up discriminating against women applicants. We need to regulate AI, and we need to do it with as much consideration and diverse input as possible. So Drew, the moment of truth.
Wait, does anyone in the comments want to sound off?
Yeah, if anyone has an opinion. I think we kind of had the same argument, so.
Yeah, I think you dislike Eric a lot more than I do.
Well, it's, I don't want to make it a personal attack. I just strongly disagree with the stance of we know more and all of you commoners can't weigh in because you just don't know enough,
I don't disagree, but at the same time, I would argue that, we've watched the hearings on Facebook, TikTok, social media companies with the House and the Senate, and those did not go well.
Yeah, that does create a perception that other people have no idea what's going on and they're living in a different reality. I get that, I do. But I also think there are a lot of experts in other arenas, right? Like there's, the societal impact, the economy. What does this mean for, marginalized people? Those are viewpoints that aren't always considered within just the tech industry. You kind of have to expand wider to look at other implications.
All right, we can talk about this more all day. Drew, who's our big winner?
It's not your video, that is for sure, Mick.
Oh, I see that. It's very unfortunate. That's very unfortunate.
That's a fantastic look. I will have to say that I think that the people have spoken. I'm looking at four different people across 3 different platforms, and I believe they're all saying Audra won.
Yay! Thank you. Oh no, now we lost Mick. Well, I guess that's what I get for winning, right? Awesome. Well, Drew, I know that you wanted to come on too, so let's go ahead and pivot now into our deep dive, and hopefully Mick will join us on the other side.
And now we talk about things that just happen to be on our minds with who's ever here, because we made this up before I knew who'd accept my meeting invite.
All right. So Drew, we may or may not have Mick for this, but I'm glad that you're joining us because this is another debate that we're having involving Google announcing a bunch of new top-level domains. I think there's 8 of them total that were recently launched by Google, including .dad, .phd, .prof, .esq, .foo, .nexus, and most controversially, .zip and .mov. And that's, of course, because zip and mov are 2 common file extensions, and there are concerns that these, TLDs could be used in order to, facilitate phishing attacks or distributing malware, confusing users. So I've seen several people recommend that companies completely block these new domains. I'm curious, what you think about that. Do you think that's the right response, or do you think it's an overreaction to the threat that it presents?
Boy, I'm so glad that Mick invited me and then bounced from the call to speak on this. I have incredibly strong feelings, Audra. I think that ICANN made a huge mistake in letting these TLDs get put under the wild. I think the fact that last night, as I was exploring the list of available TLDs, that I could go acquire the salaryinfo.zip domain is just a mistake. The internet was a mistake. And this is absolutely a mistake too.
This is building upon that mistake. It just snowballs, right? I guess the counter argument to that, Drew, is, how does this differ from, any other types of attacks that we've seen, with phishing attachments? How does this make it different? Is it just easier for people to put those, URLs in and pretend it's an attachment, or how is this different?
Yeah, so in my opinion, right, and I go back to like the wizards and muggles conversation that Kovar likes to have, and I guess since he's not here, I get to have. Oh, hey, the potato camera guy's back. I think fundamentally, right, is the muggles in the world are not used to having to follow the latest trends to understand. Like there was somebody in our internal company that we were having a discussion about this, and they didn't recognize that there's TLDs. Like, my last name is Church. I have a TLD, and you can email me at you could probably figure out the my name, right? That's not a big deal. But when you start thinking about things like .zip, right, where this is the compression file that we've had for well before I was born at the age of 13, right, Kim Zetter? Fundamentally, people are not used to not knowing that that's not going to take them to a website, and so very not hypothetically, very practically, and I just tested this out this morning just to make sure I was not crazy. But in Microsoft 365, and this is not about Microsoft, this is not about a vendor, this is just how this might be seen by somebody just that's not in the business of tech, right? If you take a URL that is copied from a OneDrive, right, like a OneDrive for business, where somebody's going to have a file repository very similar to Box or Google Drive, and then you paste that into an Outlook for the web browser and are ready to send an email, it will shorten to the file name. So if I send a link, right, that says Audra's salary increase.xlsx, right, that's the file name in OneDrive. What will show up in the email is just the file name, not the path, not that, but there's a little icon next to it. So that's XLSX. But when we think about .zip, right, now I can just put salaryinfo.zip, and your brain has already thought about, that's just a thing I do because when my colleagues send me information to go reference in an email, that's what shows up. So
yeah,
I think this is a big deal.
Well, I want to point out Tom Smith, who's at Splunk as well, pointed out in Slack earlier that, are we not going to just pretend that .com isn't just an old school command executable? Is that the same idea, or is this
how far back do you want to go, right? The original 5, com, net, org, edu,
gov,
mil, right?
Yeah.
When com came about, it was sort of a commercial, but it was also the file extension for command. There wasn't really a big stink about it. The exploits were always going to be there. And the exploits, I think, will always be there. There's going to be some crafty kid on the internet. If you look for default.zip, passwords.zip, those are already registered. By who? I have no idea. But those are already registered. And I think you're going to see a lot of it, but it's no different than you would see anyway. Having a link to an attachment or just something named salaryinfo.zip is going to be no different than a domain for most people. If you're going to click on it, you're going to click on it. I think, if anything, this might be the impetus for cybersecurity as a field to, make links safe to click on.
What about the idea of blocking all TLDs that were recently introduced? Because that was one viewpoint, that you should just block all of them anyway.
I think you were talking to the wrong two people, Audra. Drew and I both come from a DoD background where if you don't have a business use case, that TLD is not for thee. I think that's the rule from Cybercom.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting, you bring this up, is I was, right, I'm a nerd through and through, if that wasn't obvious, and I run a custom DNS server. So I'm currently using Pi-hole. And I was like, you know what? When I look at the domain list and I look through, I think I put a post out on Twitter. This was 2 years ago during the pandemic when I had nothing better to do. And Joe Sloak responded and said, hey, if you go to the SANS top 10 domain list, like just block those top 10 TLDs that of known badness, and you're probably in a good spot. And I thought about that. And I looked through that, and there were some exact, like very clear, like, yep, these are countries that maybe don't align with what I do for a living. But then there was things like .xyz, and I've only had to, in the last 2 years, unblock a single domain that's on .xyz, right? And that was actually a Splunk lab that I was doing for a customer. Like, that's it.
I remember my time at Pentagon. It was a lot of like DGA was fairly nascent, and hey, you just block any kind of. If you block one domain, the DGA is going to spin another one up, right? So you're playing whack-a-mole all day. But if you block the TLD for XYZ or for biz, if someone pushes back on it and gives you a reason, sure. But I don't think that's the answer, though, in the private sector at all. 100%, I reverse my stance.
Yeah, Dario made an interesting point in the chat about, .com means one thing, .zip means something else. It's rife for abuse. It's culturally a vernacular vulnerability, that's a good point as well. I guess I just want to see more examples of exactly how, the creativity that's going to go into how this is, abused. Because I guess that's what I'm struggling to wrap my head around is what are we going to see months from now in terms of anything different with this? Or is it going to be more of the same? It's just going to include this.
Yeah, and I think
it's going to cut out a step of opening a file.
Yeah.
But like if that's the problem is getting people to click on the thing, and this is just a little bit easier to click on the thing, I am a little bit worried about it, right? I think this is a thing that won't impact the professionals that do this for a living as much as it will just I think about my kids, I think about my parents, I think about the people who are more vulnerable in that sense. I think when you go back to how going to your point, Audra, about exploitability and what this is going to look like, I just quickly was wondering, okay, if I'm a Node.js developer or something like that, where do I get my packages? And the answer is npm. I went looking, and the top package for TLD hasn't been updated in 2 months. The last pull request for this individual, there's like one contributor on this thing, and there's over 1 million weekly downloads for this npm package, which does TLD validation, which is part of how other parts of the supply chain for these particular software, like they're going to use this package to say, is this a good or is this a bad TLD? And that's all coming from an ICANN upload. The last commit to that repository was 2 months ago. And so I could, after this, go submit probably a PR that's going to get approved later today because, oh my gosh, somebody's paying attention to somebody's open source GitHub repo, update the list, and a week, 2 weeks later, when all of my apps on all of my devices get updated that are using this npm package or the other things that support it, supply chain things, it's open season. So I think we're going to see it. It's just when and how much. Again, but to Mick's point, right, vulnerabilities, risk, likelihood, this doesn't really increase risk. I think it just marginally increases likelihood, and I think there's no reason.
I think more than marginally.
Okay.
I think this is the collective gasp you heard was the intelligence agencies across the globe, like, oh my goodness, one more thing in our toolbox.
Well, in likelihood,
it's going to be easy for a while, but then we're going to put something in place. Then we're going to introduce something else, like .exe and as a TLD.
So, out of curiosity, if they did .exe next week, because that's what somebody paid them $10,000 to register, do any of your opinions change? I don't think mine does. I think that continues to be a gigantic mistake, just like this is a gigantic mistake. Is it the TLD that matters, or is it the fact that it's somewhat like common software?
And also just the decision behind it. Like what was the driving force behind Google saying, we're going to do this, right? Like that's another question that needs to be asked, I think. Is it just, switching things up, making,
Capitalism says what?
Well, and also, you're talking about, Drew, the likelihood, and that's a factor of risk, right? Like the likelihood and then like the impact of it, and what does that mean? So if the likelihood goes up, then the risk would go up as well. So I don't know.
I just don't. I'm not clutching pearls over this one. Like it stinks. Like it's just a dumb move
Well,
.mov. Hey,
Yeah.
well, I think
but
it's
we'll
a
be all
chance
right.
to look at your allow list and your block list, right? In terms of with TLDs, right? Like, are you blocking all of those random TLDs? Is that something that you want to implement? I guess this could be a good way to have that conversation or that, you know.
Yeah. And I think that goes into like the takeaway, right? Like when we talk about what Surge is, like blue collar for the blue team, and how we could take actionable, like the things that Surge was founded on, and part of the reason why we do these talks is like, how can somebody watching, listening to this after the fact, and the answer is maybe look at your data, look at like who you're doing business in a B2B world, maybe a business to consumer. Look at what you're doing and maybe find the top 10 risky and start there. Start small and just be aware that new TLDs come into existence and that might pose a risk to you and your organization. I think that's like the takeaway there is just bringing enlightenment, the fact that this might be something that could potentially impact you.
Definitely.
Also, if you're looking at that internal data, and you click on Drew's salary.zip, you should be able to know as an analyst whether that file was open locally or whether that was a URL.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, where it starts is that's your delineation now, and it stinks that it's that granular, but I think that's the new line. And yeah, blue team guys, kids, you got a lot of more work ahead of you. I think this just makes it more difficult. .mov, Dario is a super, super good point. .mov is a movie, always has been. So I'm going to click on it because it's a movie.
Well, I guess it's, you know, being more mindful of when your mouse hovers over, you know,
Yes.
is it an attachment? Is it a URL? And that's, you know, something to be more aware of, I guess. But yeah, definitely a good point. So, well, we could keep going on and on about this, but I am curious to see, you know, if we see a report 2-3 months from now with some new insights about how this is being used, that I'm curious to see if that's what happens.
Well,
So,
now we have our end of summer recap episode planned.
yes, exactly. What was the creativity with this? Where did it go? Because I'm not feeling all that creative right now. So on that note, thank you everyone so much for listening. It's been great meeting with you and Mick and Drew. Thanks for stopping by and maybe Mick, next time we'll work on your internet connection.
Don't blame me. It's, you know,
It's just it
it's
happens.
Ryan from afar. It's what it is.
Right.
It's what it is.
He has to interfere in some way with the show. But anyway, thank you everyone so much for joining. And we'll have another episode next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific. We'll have an interview with Sydney Howard. She is the principal threat hunter at Splunk. I'm really looking forward to speaking with her about her job and what a day in the life entails. So stay tuned for that next Tuesday, 11 o'clock. And then we'll be back with Coffee Talk the week after that. So with that, have a great day. We'll see you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Surge.